Waiver Wire Winners heading into the fantasy football playoffs. Matthew Stafford has finished as the quarterback 7, quarterback 8, and the quarterback 5 for fantasy football across the last 3 games. A lot of that is due to the 4, 3, and 3 passing touchdowns during those 3 games. Stafford is averaging 35 passing attempts per game. He's top 10 in yards per attempt and averages 255.2 passing yards per game this season. Odell Beckham Jr. had his revenge game in Week 14 against the Rams, catching 4 of his 10 targets for 97 yards and a touchdown, 19.7 fantasy points. 3 games of 14-plus fantasy points across the last 5 games, 4 weeks of 7-plus targets. The trio of Deonta Foreman, Khalil Herbert, and Roschon Johnson were all active in Week 14 for Chicago. But it was Foreman who played 55% of the snaps and totaled 13 touches. Foreman has had games of 33 and 17.2 fantasy points this season, and 3 weeks of 80-plus rushing yards. 5 total touchdowns as well. He looks like the lead back in Chicago. Tyjae Spears has totaled 10 receptions across the last 2 games. Spears has had 6 games of 4-plus receptions. 89 receiving yards in Week 14. It was the 3rd week over 40 receiving yards. The rookie has scored 17.8 fantasy points in Week 14. It was the 2nd game for him over 16 fantasy points and the 4th of 10-plus fantasy points. So yes, he is the handcuff to Derrick Henry, but he has plenty of standalone value because of the pass-catching upside. Jonathan Mingo has totaled 19 targets across the last 2 games, 7, 6, and 6 in the weeks prior. He hasn't turned the volume into a ton, but there are signs for better days to come. It's evident that the Panthers are trying to get their rookie involved. 3 weeks of 60-plus receiving yards and 3 weeks of double-digit fantasy points this season. 2 goose eggs in a row for Noah Brown doesn't look super sexy, but Tank Dell is done for the year. Nico Collins might be banged up. And if we flash back to weeks 9 and 10, he finished with 153 and 172 receiving yards and scored 27.3 and 24.2 fantasy points. So we've seen some big upside weeks out of Noah Brown, and his opportunity to be very involved in this offense is there. Christian Kirk is going to miss time, which means a big bump for guys like Zay Jones and Parker Washington, who I'll talk about in a second. I personally prefer Jones over Washington. Zay Jones has earned 8 and then 14 targets across the last 2 games. He's caught 10 of them. 78 receiving yards in Week 13. He opened up the season with 16.5 fantasy points, and he had 4 weeks of 21-plus fantasy points just last season. Parker Washington, same team, 9 targets the last 2 weeks, playing 59% and then 62% of the snaps. The rookie caught 6 passes for 61 yards in Week 13 and has had back-to-back weeks scoring a touchdown. Everyone seemed to be counting out the Bengals offense in Jake Browning's first start, but he's had back-to-back weeks finishing as the quarterback 4 for fantasy football. 354 and 275 passing yards, 3 total touchdowns, and he rushed for a touchdown in these games. It's a good system, right? You got Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Joe Mixon, Tyler Boyd, and Browning looks pretty good for fantasy football right now. Baker Mayfield may or may not be available in your league, but he's had 6 weeks as a top 12 quarterback, including Week 14. 7 weeks of throwing multiple touchdowns in a game, and 4 weeks of 265-plus passing yards this season. Wan'Dale Robinson is a guy I just have always liked. I think he's probably the most talented wide receiver in that New York Giants wide receiver room. He caught 6 of his 7 targets for 79 yards and also rushed twice for 36 yards for 17.5 fantasy points in Week 14. 3 games of 13-plus fantasy points this season. I think Wan'Dale is just the reliable slot option for Tommy DeVito in this offense. Rashid Shaheed has missed time with a thigh injury, and it's something we have to monitor still, but this guy has shown us so much upside this season. Weeks of 19, 18.3, and 24.3 fantasy points. Weeks of 17.8, 15.75, 14, 42.5, and 51 yards per catch. Alexander Madison exited Week 14 with an ankle injury we will have to monitor, which meant Ty Chandler took on the running back 1 role for the Vikings. 15 touches in Week 14. He's had 2 double-digit fantasy scoring weeks this season. Quentin Johnston, the first-round rookie for the Chargers, has been trending up. 5 receptions for 52 yards in Week 13, 3 receptions for 91 yards in Week 14. He has become the default wide receiver 2 for the Chargers. The asterisk, though, is that Justin Herbert sustained an injury, which may or may not mean him returning this season. So Jerick McKinnon and Clyde Edwards-Helaire split time with Isaiah Pacheco out in Week 14. McKinnon ended up scoring and he caught 3 passes. He's had 4 weeks of catching 3 passes. Part of me thinks that this wide receiver room outside of Rice is just poor. And there's a chance that McKinnon's role can increase towards the end of the season, kind of similar to what happened last year. And he ended last season with 3 weeks of 22-plus fantasy points. Demarcus Robinson might be a deeper flex as the wide receiver 3 for the Rams, but he's earned 5 and then 10 targets the last 2 games. He just played 86% of the snaps in Week 14. He produced 55 and 46 receiving yards the last 2 weeks with back-to-back games with a touchdown. And we know Matthew Stafford is averaging a good amount of passing attempts this season at 35. Bailey Zappi is the new quarterback, and New England is coming off of a hot week. So if you want to take a stab at one of the wide receivers for the Patriots, you can take a look at Demario Douglas or Juju Smith-Schuster. The rookie, Douglas, has missed time with a concussion, but in the last 5 games he's played, he earned 6, 7, 7, 9, and 9 targets, which is pretty consistent volume. During that 5-game span, he scored double-digit fantasy points in 4 of those. And then Juju Smith-Schuster earned 6 targets in Week 14. He caught 4 of them for 90 yards. And finally, it's cuffing season. So take a look at these guys if you have the roster space to stash a handcuff for the fantasy football playoffs for the running back position. Tons more coming out this week. Be sure you are following the Fantrax socials wherever you are consuming fantasy football content.